Welcome back to the Bulwark, everybody. I am Ben Parker of the Bulwark. Very, very happy to be joined today by retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who is talking to us today about the job of Secretary of Defense. You have a great piece up on the Bulwark homepage right now. Does Pete Hegseth have what it takes to be Secretary of Defense? Hegseth, for those who have not been following, Donald Trump's pick to lead the military, the American military. He's a controversial pick for a number of reasons. There are allegations of sexual assault against him, reports of alcohol abuse, and alleged financial mismanagement of the two charity groups he ran. But General Hertling, that's not really what you focused on in your piece. Tell us a little bit what you wrote about and why you think it's important.
Well, I think it's important, Ben, to start off by saying this is not the first piece I've written about the job of the Secretary of Defense. When previous retired General Austin was being nominated back in 2016, I also wrote a piece for CNN.com about that and the challenges of hiring a retired general to go into the position. But in that piece, I basically said, hey, there are some bad things about hiring generals, and we had just come out of the previous Trump administration where previous retired General Mattis had become the Secretary of Defense, and I thought he had done a very good job. But a lot of people were saying, hey, we don't need another general in the higher ranks. But because of some of the challenges of the day, I wrote that article and said, I don't like seeing a retired flag officer as a Secretary of Defense either, but he brings to Austin, brings to this some things I know about because I know Lloyd Austin very well. He's a West Point classmate of mine. He was my boss in Iraq as a 4-star general when I was a 2-star. So I shaped it that way. And with this article today, what I was just trying to bring out is I think a lot of pundits and analysts on TV channels and then the newspapers are focusing only on Mr. Hegseth's problems with sexual assault and drunkenness and some of the things he's doing, but no one has really addressed the demands of the job. So I thought what I'd try and do is lay out what are the intricacies of this CEO named the Secretary of Defense that runs one of the largest organizations in the world, and what it's going to take for a newcomer to get involved in it that doesn't have any experience in either government, large corporations, or a small amount of experience in the military, which is what Mr. Hegseth has.
Yeah, he was, I believe, a major in the Army, deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, but has spent most of his time as a Fox News weekend host. And you write, the allegations against Hegseth are serious, but there is a more fundamental question that the president-elect, his advisors, and every senator should ask about Hegseth. Does he have the skills and experience to succeed at the job? So there are basically 5 points you make here, 5 skills or abilities that every successful Secretary of Defense needs. And so I figured we'd just run through them. But before we do, just tell us a little bit about, you mentioned working with or for 4 different Secretaries of Defense. So tell us about what jobs you were in and how you saw them work.
Yeah, well, working for was Secretary Rumsfeld when I was in the Pentagon for my one and only tour of a 2-year tour. And I was came in as the Vice J7 on the Joint Staff, which means I was in charge of war plans, joint doctrine, joint training, joint education, and the kinds of things that are part of transformation of the military, which is just one of the 8 different elements of the Joint Staff. Well, in that role, I spent a significant amount of time with Secretary Rumsfeld talking specifically about both war plans and joint force doctrine and education, because he had a lot of brand new initiatives coming in as the secretary. But then later on, I became the acting J7, which was a 3-star position, even though I was still a 1-star general. And I would see Mr. Rumsfeld on an average of about once a week. And it also occurred that, within my first month there, 9/11 occurred. So we had a lot of interactions with the secretary, both in war planning, but also seeing what he was doing in terms of force deployment, force training and education, and how we were getting the various branches of the services prepared first for Afghanistan and then later on in Iraq.
And the other three secretaries of defense, you were
Yeah.
out in the field, right?
Yeah, the other three were Secretary Panetta, who came from the CIA to the Department of Defense, and I had some engagements with him based on some things we were doing in Iraq, primarily from the intelligence arena. Secretary Cohen, early on in my career, actually there's five. Secretary Gates, who visited us several times in Iraq, and who spanned the Bush and the Obama administration. Obama kept him on as the Secretary of Defense because he was so good. Another individual who had had a lot of time in government. And then finally, Secretary Austin, who I said, I wasn't in the service with him. I had retired by the time he became the Secretary of Defense, but I've watched him closely and have engaged with him on a couple of occasions in different events.
Okay, so the first thing that you say that successful secretaries do is master the details and the big picture. So explain a little bit to us what you mean by that, and why a secretary needs to be able to do both of those things.
Well, just from the military perspective primarily, it shocked me because I was a brand new one-star going into the Pentagon, how much the secretary put his fingers into the different pieces of war planning, contingency planning, the joint force, deployment opportunities, the personnel arena, testifying on the Hill. And it especially became obvious during the early stages of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But you have to know the details of not just one force. And Mr. Hegseth has had experience in the National Guard with the Army. But he's also going to be overseeing the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Space Force, and at times the Coast Guard, as well as some of the other dynamics of the combatant commanders. And what I talked about in the first segment of the paper is the Secretary of Defense actually gives the orders to these four-star generals. Four-star generals who in many cases have 30 to 40 years of experience, who have risen through the ranks and who know the intricate details of their planning and operations. And to a degree, if you're the CEO of an organization, in my view, you've got to know a whole lot about what's going on underneath within your departments. So you have not only the six combatant commanders that span the globe, but also the functional commands like Transportation Command and Strategic Command, which handles all our nuclear weapons, and the Special Operations Command, which obviously has our Special Operations Force, Cyber Command, which is dealing with cyber attacks and security. So the span of that is just, if you don't understand that that's just one portion of it, and that you truthfully, as the Secretary of the Defense, are the boss of all these very experienced and savvy people, men and women, it will be a shock when you have to start engaging with them.
Yeah, it's just an unbelievably big job. So the first one was a bit of a dialectic, think, big and small. The second one is similar, think long-term and short-term. So why does the secretary also have to think both in like decades and in hours, days, weeks?
Well, one of the things I didn't dwell on in the piece was the acquisition process. So what you have to do as a secretary is monitor how much money you're spending on different programs, and there is the dialogue between the services, because each services wants a bigger slice than they're allocated for not only their manpower and their training and operations, but also for new equipment. And especially in today's world where there's a rapid turnover of equipment, that acquisition process can be mind-numbing in terms of what you're trying to do to modernize the force continuously, because you're facing modern forces from all over the world that are your threats. And in that case, I'd also say you're not just looking at the big picture items. Like I mentioned in the piece, the B-23 bomber and the MRAPs that came into Iraq. And that goes from a strategic bomber all the way down to a truck that's driving people around the battlefield. There's that and everything in between. The building of submarines and aircraft carriers. Those are the big ticket items. But when you talk about the spectrum of operations that the military involves itself with, you're talking about full-scale nuclear war potential conventional strikes, counterinsurgencies, counterterrorism, humanitarian relief, peacekeeping forces. I mean, it goes from really large operations down to the sending of small forces to different places in the world, and they all have to be man trained and equipped and cared for. And that's what the Secretary of Defense has on his plate.
Yeah, we talk about things like planes and submarines a lot more than we talk about things like boots and pants and the other things, gasoline, the other things the Pentagon buys a lot of.
Right.
All right, so this I think is really where you get to the meat of your argument. Number 3 of 5 is just lead the world's biggest organization. That's sort of tough to get your mind around, but there's one boss at the top of the biggest organization in the world, right?
Yeah, and when you look at the organizational diagram, since I retired in 2013, I've worked with and for various companies, and the first thing you always look for is show me the organizational diagram so I can see where different things are happening. When you look at the Defense Department's organizational diagram and the things they do, I think it would boggle most Americans' minds. Until 3 years ago, when India built an office building in one of their cities, the Pentagon was the biggest office building in the world. 25,000 people work there, and they're all just a small fraction of the 3 million that work for the Department of Defense. You have a multi-billion-dollar budget. If you include personnel pay and some of the other requirements, it gets into the 1.x trillion dollars amount that you're managing and having to really divide between everything, as we said, operations all the way to acquisitions of new equipment. Now, you've got people helping you with that. The secretary has deputy secretaries of defenses and undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, but the individual that sits in that chair is like the CEO of a exceedingly large organization that I can't even find one to compare with the Department of Defense. GM pales in significance. Procter and Gamble is a small organization compared to the Department of Defense. So what you're asking any individual to do to come in there is not only lead but manage an organization with 3 million people that the sun never sets on all over the globe, and that you have a budget that is unfathomable and so many dynamics that you have to focus your attention on. And by the way, every once in a while, there's a major crisis in the world where people start shooting at each other. I don't know of any corporation that has to deal with that on a large scale. But this is what the Secretary of Defense has to manage. So it's always good to have someone with executive presence, a term used in the business world now, and executive management and strategic leadership capabilities going into this position.
Yeah, I think that's a point that doesn't get made nearly enough, is that, this person is a leader in the sense of the term that they can't do things themselves, right? The Secretary of Defense cannot go drive a submarine, cannot go shoot at a target, can't do anything, right? Their job is only to get other people all moving in the same direction, all moving toward the same vision. And just to, you have these great stats here about just how active the military is on any given day. And this is in peacetime. This is any given day in peacetime. You write, the Army has more than 180,000 soldiers deployed around the world for a variety of missions. The Navy has more than 100 ships at sea, and the Air Force launches more than 5,000 sorties. So that's just a normal peacetime operations, a huge amount of activity.
That's a daily basis. I mean, when I was the commander of U.S. Army Europe, at the beginning, I had about 60,000 soldiers under my command. That was a lot, and they were everywhere across the continent of Europe. I mean, we did theater security cooperation exercises. We were sending air defense pieces of equipment to Israel. We were doing things in Turkey. I mean, just managing the continent with 60,000 soldiers kept me pretty busy. You multiply that by a component of X that I can't even think of when you're talking about the Secretary of Defense concerning himself with that. And then not only managing the force, but also managing all those other things we talked about, the acquisition programs, the training programs, the education, the personnel. It is unbelievably difficult. And yeah, the numbers you cite are the ones I put in the piece, but I'd ask ramp that up when we're talking about the U.S. involved in potential combat operations. and deploying forces that are the right kind for the right places. I mean, Pete Hegseth was an infantry platoon leader. He had a grand total of about 19 people under his charge. No, that's a tank platoon, about 30 people under his charge. So, you can tell the difference between the leadership requirements and the strategic management requirements of the two positions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, the other thing that you get into here, point number 4, is not just that you're managing all the combatant commands and managing the different agencies and managing the acquisitions, you're also managing the politics. And this, I think, is a really key skill that in my reading of history, is that a lot of secretaries of defense haven't focused on enough, probably, or that people don't think about enough when they're thinking of a secretary, is that this person is a politician and needs to be a politician, not just around Washington, but around the world. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You asked me at the very beginning, how many did I engage with? The majority of the ones I engaged with, I was seeing in either Europe or the Middle East or in Korea when they would come to visit. And it was fascinating to me. And I had to do, to a degree, the same kind of things on a much lesser scale of engagement with foreign dignitaries. So you've got to have a knowledge of the close to 200 countries in the world as you go to different places. Now, you get intelligence reads before you go there and you know who the people are, but you got to have a whole lot of savvy to engage with them. And, there's an expression called diplomats in khaki that describe the military. And that describes the Secretary of Defense. He and the Secretary of State and we've seen this in Iraq and Afghanistan for sure, they are hand in glove, and they've got to be singing off the same sheet of music. One of my favorite movies is Drumline, and that the great line from that movie is "one band, one sound." You can't be going off in different directions when you're dealing with the national power of the military, the national power of diplomacy, the national power of intelligence and economics. So the secretary has to combine with all those other secretaries and get on one sheet of music under the president, depending on what the president is asking them all to do. And they've got to have a little bit of personal courage. I think, there's been a lot of talk in the media about a lot of these secretaries going in a slash and burn mode and, tearing organizations apart and getting rid of the deep state and all that. I think many of them will be surprised when they get into these organizations yeah, there's some bureaucracy and there's some fluff to be sure. And there's probably a whole lot of cuts you can make on budgets inside organizations, especially the Defense Department. But I got to tell you, the organizational design in most of these organizations are pretty good in terms of addressing the key factors that the institution has to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's talk also a little bit. You get in here about how the Secretary of Defense has to deal with Congress. Because that's a little bit different than how a president has to deal with Congress, and definitely different than how a general or another officer has to deal with Congress. So tell us a little bit about that and why it's so important.
Yeah, well, first of all, probably the most important thing is the secretary has to fight for the budget. And that's what he's got to make friends on both sides of the aisle. He can't be either one party or the other. Certainly he's working for a boss, the president, who is of one party. But when he goes before Congress, he has to get everybody on the same sheet as well. I mean, there are going to be congressional delegations who want military in their districts. And I experienced this in Europe, not being a constituent of anyone. So I had to fight with the secretary for my constituency, which was U.S. Army Europe, which no congressman was all that concerned about. So you're dealing with the fights of getting more forces to Fort Moore, Georgia, or Fort Cavazos, Texas, or Lackland Air Force Base. And there are congressional delegations that say, I want more at my place. So that's an issue. But I got to tell you, I mean, that doesn't draw as much attention. The budget doesn't draw as much attention as some of the other things that the secretary and the chairman often get called to the Congress to report on. I mean, there are everything from the sublime secret kind of conversations they have with members of the intelligence community, all the way down to some of the more ridiculous things that they have to account to on the House Armed Services Committee, as an example. And we've all seen those kind of testimonies. But when you watch the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs appear before those congressional committees and senatorial committees, sometimes it's very important stuff, and sometimes you got to say, "Oh my gosh, you are really uh, making their day by calling them in for a couple hours of just beratement." And I used a quote that Secretary Panetta once told me that he said, all of his friends from his days as a congressman would always treat him nice in the office calls, but when they were in the hearing room and the red light of C-SPAN came on, they all became pit bulls. And that's just what you have to deal with in that kind of a political environment.
Yeah, no, you make a great point in here that the Secretary of Defense answers to a lot of different people, right? He answers to the people who make up the military, including the senior officers who are the experts, like you were. He also answers to the president, who of course is the commander in chief. He also answers to the Congress, who cut the checks, and in a way, he also answers directly to the American people who form the military, right? Because that's where the military draws from. That's who signs up, or if there's a draft, gets drafted. So there's a lot of different forces pulling in different directions, and the secretary kind of has to balance them all. It's a very difficult political job, and as you said, not necessarily one that fits for someone who wants to slash and burn.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are so many examples that you could talk about in this regard. I mean, the whole dust up about DEI and critical race theory began at West Point when the mother of a cadet wrote one of her congressmen about how there was a panel at West Point where a CRT expert was involved with talking about her subject area. Wasn't even a guest speaker, it was just a member of a panel. Well, that got to the House Armed Services, and I watched the Secretary of Defense and the chairman get grilled about how much critical race theory and DEI was ruining the military because of one letter from a constituent. There was another time I remember when I was in Iraq, Secretary Rumsfeld came over and had a town hall with a bunch of soldiers, and one soldier asked, "When are we going to start getting up armored Humvee?" And the secretary was kind of flip in answering while the cameras were rolling, and he basically said, "Well, you got to go to war with the stuff you have, not with the stuff you want." Well, that's not very comforting to a young guy that's getting shot out every day. And you can bet there were a lot of parents that wrote the Secretary of Defense and soldiers that were not enamored with his answer on that one.
So we would be remiss if we didn't briefly return to the subject here of Pete Hegseth. I think we've outlined what a big job it is. You write that as part of their constitutional duties, senators tasked to confirm a nominee are right to ask tough questions about whether any candidate can lead a large and diverse organization, manage large and complex budgets, inspire a workforce willing to give their lives for the country, and untangle political knots in Washington, D.C. and around the world. I will leave our viewers and readers to make their decision for themselves whether they think Pete Hegseth is up to that job. But I want to ask you as a last question, this last one, which is you write that you're not sure with your experience that you would be equipped to do the job or that you would want it. So tell me a little bit about that. What kind of person do you think is well equipped to do the job? And what kind of person do you think has the right sort of personality to do the job well?
Yeah, well, first, the personality, and you mentioned this at the very beginning of our conversation. The first thing you got to have is someone, in my view, you got to have someone with a terrific character, someone who has a personal set of values which will guide them in decision making, and someone who, truthfully, because they raised their hand on their first day of office, defends the Constitution and is willing to put their personal courage on the line to defend that Constitution and the people that work for them, which are 3 million in this case. But once you get past that, then you have to take a look at who has experience with the military, who has potentially experience leading a large organization, like a public sector organization as a CEO or as one of the major board members or something like that. Someone who has experience with politics and who can be savvy and has, again, I go back to the term executive presence, which means immediately as they walk into the room, there is a professionalism and a gravitas and a sense of values and integrity, and who will understand that they're in probably one of the four most important jobs in the cabinet, and that's the Defense Department, because when you ask our young men and women who sign up and raise their hand for the oath to go to war, you better not be flippant about it. You better be professional, and you better understand the implications of sending people off to fight, and how it interacts with politics. And with that note too, I mean, one of the most important thing I think anyone that's in the cabinet or in the military can do, is have the personal, I go back to personal courage, and have the personal courage to say, this is not a good idea. We can't do that either legally or morally, and really provide good advice to the president to help that president execute the duties of their office. You just can't take orders. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of individuals who have proclaimed their fealty or loyalty to an individual, as opposed to understanding that their main job is to serve the citizens of our country in a key position working for a president.
I think that applies just as well to the senators who will be in Hegseth's confirmation hearing on January 14th. I really hope they read your piece. I hope they have it in front of them as they're questioning him, and I hope they keep it in the back of their minds thereafter. General Mark Hertling, thank you so much for joining me, and keep coming back to the Bulwark with more content for you soon.